right, welcome everyone to our webinar, our Bike Walk Every Town webinar on working with IDOT, the Illinois Department of Transportation. We're going to dig into how to better understand our state agency and how to best work with them to improve walking and biking on upcoming road projects. So my name is Maggie Mullen, and I am an advocacy manager at the Active Transportation Alliance. We are a nonprofit. We advocate for walking, biking, and public transit to create healthy, sustainable, equitable communities. And we work in the Chicagoland region. The Bike Walk Every Town program is our suburban advocacy program. And this webinar, we have a series of webinars. This webinar is actually applicable to really anyone in the state of Illinois. So welcome to all of you. So if you have questions during the webinar, if you're on your computer watching the PowerPoint presentation, there's a comment box in one of your corners. You can add a comment, ask a question. You can also email me if you happen to only be on your phone. I'm at maggie@activetrans.org. And we are recording the webinar, so you can re-listen to this at any time and definitely share it with others who you think may be interested. And we'll address questions at the end of the webinar. And today we have three speakers, three experts. We've got Heather Schady from the Active Transportation Alliance, Ed Barsotti from Ride, Illinois, and Tim Gustafson from Epstein. And I am going to hand it over to Heather, and she's going to kick off the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Maggie. So today we are going to talk everything that we know about IDOT. And to kick it off, I'll walk us through a resource that Active Transportation Alliance produced a couple years back called Working Collaboratively with IDOT. So we'll have a little bit of a history of the IDOT's Complete Streets work and talk about how you might be able to intervene in projects that IDOT is leading or is involved in. Following my talk, Ed will give you a little more detail about how to respond to requests from IDOT and give you some tips and tricks on what to say when you're working on specific projects. And we'll also go over tips from advocates. And Tim is kind enough to join us here today to talk about examples from communities that have done different IDOT-led projects and gotten some complete streets facilities on them. So hopefully we are able to give you some of our knowledge as best we can. Okay, so launching right into this, I think it's important to just start with a history on complete streets in Illinois. So Illinois is one of the earlier states to have a complete streets policy whatsoever. They first started talking about complete streets in the early 90s. And that happened when IDOT introduced pedestrian and bicycle accommodation policy into its Bureau of Design and Environment Manual, which you'll hear me refer to as the BDE throughout this presentation. And what that is a rule book that really outlines design standards that apply to state-owned roads or roads that involve the state in different ways. So if you go to that 4,000 plus page manual, you'll learn a lot from it, but it's also a really complicated guide that can get kind of convoluted if you spend too much time in it. So in the manual, when they updated it in the 90s, they included 4 different types of bike facilities. And you can see them on your screen here. That includes paved shoulders, so the upper right-hand picture, side paths, the upper left-hand picture, bike lanes, which is the lower right-hand picture, and then wide outside curb lanes, which is the lower left-hand picture. So at that time, what that meant, including these different facilities in the manual, that these are really the things that IDOT was saying we can do on state roads or state-funded roads to accommodate bicyclists. And so this policy kind of stuck for a long time because it's difficult to update manuals, to say the least. And so even these were kind of the facilities we were instructed to use if we were working on bikeway projects over the years. So following the adoption of these standards into the BDE in the late 2000s, bike advocates like Ed at Ride Illinois and some folks at Active Trans began pushing IDOT for complete streets legislation. And this happened specifically when a teenager was killed crossing a bridge over the Fox River on his bike. In response to that, in the summer of 2007, the Illinois General Assembly adopted Public Act 95-665, which is Illinois' Complete Streets Policy. And here, so this isn't a design manual. This is really just the written rules that IDOT abides by when they approach projects. So the complete streets approach that was recommended in this policy was for IDOT to consider inclusion of complete streets during the construction, reconstruction, or any other changes of a state transportation facility. So again, this law, like the BDE updates, was adopted before a lot of the best practices were developed around complete streets policies. And so once again, we're sort of working with an older policy here that may not apply to existing standards. Okay, so just moving on to IDOT's process for decision making on complete streets projects. There's a few cases where IDOT has a say. I think the most unexpected one would be when a project is happening on a road that they control. Obviously, they'll have a say over what goes on it and what doesn't. But beyond that, when you're talking about local roads, there are often times where IDOT plays a pretty key role in decision making around design. So that can include anytime your municipality is using federal funding to pay for a project. So if they get a CMAQ grant or STP or any of those other major grant funding sources that you hear Maggie emailing about, that will trigger IDOT's process. In addition, if your community is using motor vehicle fuel tax dollars, that can also trigger IDOT's process. And then finally, the kind of third and final way that it can happen is if the project is occurring on a road that crosses the national highway system or a state road. Once again, IDOT will be involved in review and will also have a lot to say about the design and how it relates to their standards. When I talked about the complete streets policy in the 2 slides ago, what the policy alludes to, but it wasn't really specifically stated in the policy section, is that there's really only a few ways that IDOT is obligated to provide improvements for complete streets. And so there's several types of projects that IDOT works on, but complete streets are not always a requirement on them. So you may often hear that IDOT's working on a resurfacing project on a state highway in your community. Usually, and I would say always, the complete streets policy is not triggered for resurfacing projects. So IDOT has no obligation to provide complete streets improvements when it's just a resurfacing project. This is in part due to cost. For resurfacing, they're really looking at trying to maintain existing conditions or modify them in ways that won't really have an impact on traffic. If they do have an impact on traffic, then they'll have to do additional study, which is outside of the scope of resurfacing. But in some cases, you may convince IDOT to consider including complete streets. Like if IDOT's resurfacing a road, but there's an opportunity to do a road diet, IDOT may say yes if the local jurisdiction agrees to pay for any additional improvements outside of the scope of the resurfacing project, and also make sure they're studying the implications of whatever recommendation they're asking for. Now, that's for resurfacing, but when IDOT is doing larger projects, a reconstruction of a road, building a new road, expanding a road, redoing an intersection, or rebuilding a bridge, that is when the complete streets policy is triggered. So that's, basically means IDOT will review recommendations that are made by the local community, and if they approve them, they'll ask the community to pay for a 20% match of any off-road pedestrian and bicycle improvement. So next slide, please. All right, so just some tips about how to influence IDOT's process. I think the first thing to know is to get in as early in the process as possible. If you're working on a project, think about in your own work. If you start at the scoping phase of things when you're just starting to map out what you're doing, it's much easier to make changes than it would be after you've written an entire document or done an entire made all the decisions. So just like in your work, IDOT will feel the same way. They want to kind of know what they need to do at the beginning so it saves time and money. Uh, it's also important to demonstrate community support for the project. So if your community has an active transportation plan, a bike plan, a complete streets policy, or even a corridor study or downtown plan that influences or that has recommendations that impact the corridor that IDOT is looking at or the intersection, that showing them that the community has vetted this idea, their support for it can really help bring that project forward. Uh, I think the other thing is just to always circle back to the goals of the project. So, oftentimes I know we run into this, I'm sure many of you have, when you're talking to engineers, they sometimes get stuck in thinking about free-flowing traffic or, just different things that may not focus on people-friendly design. So it's really good to remind IDOT that, these recommendations, making bicycle improvements or pedestrian improvements, really help with their other goals like Vision Zero or their state bike plan. Some other quick tips, again, I think that we've seen this from a lot of the advocates locally, is using data and doing walk audits can really help make your case. So say an intersection has a high number of crashes and it's being impacted by an IDOT project, that can be the time to say, look, we really need to improve these safety features and make sure that we're addressing any changes or addressing the concerns and modifying the intersection to make it safer for people. Another tool that we've used in the past to convince decision makers like IDOT officials to make changes is to use walk audits. So taking people, your elected officials, IDOT officials, your local engineer to the place that you'd like to see a change made can really help them see how people are using it, and kind of talk through and work through live how the space can change. And then finally, the final tip we have, which we'll talk about a bit more in this presentation, is to take advantage of any ambiguity in the design guidelines. So as I mentioned earlier, IDOT's policies were adopted long before a lot of the national standards were developed, and therefore there's newer guidance that promotes different features that IDOT doesn't currently accept within their manuals. So you can use that to your advantage and make the case, hopefully, for changes and improvements to be made. Okay, so next slide. So this really complicated chart is actually an abbreviated version of the project delivery process that IDOT has in its design manual. And so we tried to make it less complicated, but it still looks pretty intimidating if you ask me. So what you should know from this is that there are 5 major phases of the project delivery process. And the first 2 phases are around project selection and initiating the project. But where the people like us come in is usually within the phase 1, which is the environmental and engineering phases. So this is where the scope of the project is determined and studies are made to assess any impacts that the project will have on the community, the environment, and other things. Following phase 1, I'll talk a little bit more about each of these, comes phase 2. And during that time, it's usually when detailed engineering plans are created. And then finally is phase 3, when the project is constructed. So the most important thing to remember from this slide is that the earlier you get in on IDOT's process, the better. So the best opportunity to advocate for bicycle and pedestrian or transit access within an IDOT project is to start in phase 1. So one of the ways that you can anticipate what IDOT is considering working on in the next few years is to visit their multi-year program site. So this slide shows a map of all the projects that IDOT will be hopefully working on within the next 5-year period. So you can kind of click on it, zoom in, zoom out to your community, and figure out what roads are being considered for improvements and what the project improvement will be. And so there you can kind of know to reach out to your municipal leaders, whether it's your public works or engineering department, your planners, or your elected officials, and say, hey, this street, this highway in our community is being considered for or resurfacing or reconstruction by IDOT in the next few years. Let's sit down and figure out what we want to advocate for when IDOT contacts you, so we know how to respond and provide those bicycle and pedestrian facilities. Okay, so back to our fun project delivery chart. Uh, Now that we've talked a little bit about phase one, there's a few more things to remember. And so the, the this step will kind of involve a lot of different pieces, and it'll depend on what IDOT is proposing to do. The process may vary a little bit, but that letter that or the first step that you'll kind of hear from once you know that IDOT is doing a project is probably a letter that will go to your municipality asking them, notifying them that they're doing a project and that IDOT's interested in knowing what additional improvements you'd like to see made, basically. So next slide, please. So once that kind of scoping phase happens, there's some other things to remember. In some cases, you'll want to look for what's called a categorical exclusion, which means that IDOT can actually reduce the amount of analysis that needs to be done on a project if there are no significant impacts that are made by it. And oftentimes, bicycle and pedestrian facilities can fall under this categorical exclusion. So some of the impacts that IDOT usually looks at in phase one engineering are impacts to land use or growth, impacts to the natural areas, any cultural impacts it might have, impacts on air and water, noise, travel patterns. So in many cases, a bicycle or pedestrian facility will not have any kind of negative impact, and it'll make the process for approving it easier for IDOT and therefore less costly for IDOT and your municipality. So keep that in mind. And then next slide, please. Okay, so so we kind of talked about phase one. Again, that's kind of the key place that you want to intervene in an IDOT process and make sure that any kind of bicycle or pedestrian facility that needs to be included should be included within especially a reconstruction project or a bridge project or one of the other things that actually triggers a complete streets policy. So phase two, again, we didn't talk much about it, but that's when IDOT's preparing the construction plans. There are a few places that you can intervene there, but it's much more difficult because the IDOT's already been through the process. So any kind of update or change may result in kind of going backwards in time and redoing some of those more complicated steps, which again costs money and time and isn't something that often IDOT is interested in doing. Then when you move into phase three, which is the construction phase, there is still some time to intervene there. I mean, there's some chances you can, but only minor changes can be made. So maybe you notice that the plans didn't include upgrading ADA curb ramps or crosswalk striping. Those kinds of minor changes can be made in an IDOT project, but again, it'll be a little more difficult for them to make that change. Okay. So that's a little bit about the project delivery process. Again, this is it's much more involved and complicated, and we do have a manual that you can, or a guide that you can review if you want to learn more about it. So know that this is just kind of the very basic Cliff Notes version. Okay, so going back to making the case to IDOT, there's a few other things that you can do as you're working with IDOT to ensure that they include complete streets facilities in any project they're working with you on. So that includes, as I mentioned earlier, identifying points of conflict, asking for more than what's required, even when it's not on the table, when the primary recommendation can't be met, asking for the next best facility, and then highlighting a mismatch with federal standards. So I'll talk a little bit more about each of these. So first, just identifying points of conflict within the design guidelines. So the BDE, that big manual that I mentioned earlier, has some mixed messages interspersed throughout it about especially intersection design. So in some cases, the BDE supports designing intersections to kind of not inhibit the free flow of traffic, ensure that turns are designed safely for people who are driving. But in other cases, the BDE includes guidance on designing intersections for pedestrian and bicycle safety. And so oftentimes you can do one or the other, but not both in the way the manual is written. So you can kind of point to where those conflicts are and make the case for your design being the better design because it supports pedestrians and cyclists who are the most vulnerable users. Another thing that you'll want to do is ask for the next best facility. So say you're working on a roadway project with IDOT and what you really want to see is a side path on that road, but because it's maybe not, maybe the right of way is too complicated or there's other issues that IDOT says no to, you may be able to ask for the next best facility, which could be a paved shoulder or some other facility. So just because you don't get exactly what you want, you may be able to get a compromise and work that out with IDOT to at least provide some pedestrian and bicycle accommodation. Uh, You'll also want to highlight a mismatch with federal standards. So again, I talked about this a little bit in previous slides, but we know that there's a lot of facilities that people are using that have been approved by the FHWA and other design authorities that just aren't within IDOT's manual at the moment. And one key example of this is protected bike lanes. So this is a picture of Elston Avenue in Chicago, which used to just have a bike lane on it. It was a 4-lane street. And for years, lots of people were saying we need to improve Elston Avenue. Unfortunately, I'm sorry, I'm saying Elston, it's Clybourne, not my morning. So unfortunately, it took a pretty high-profile crash to occur where a cyclist was riding down the street and was killed by a drunk driver to kind of trigger a response for change from IDOT. But the agency did work successfully with CDOT to develop its first ever protected bike lane. And so far, it's been a very successful project, both in terms of a cyclist perspective, but also drivers have noted that traffic patterns have improved quite a bit on the street. So know that it is possible to work with the agency to install facilities like this, things that aren't within their manuals, but it can be a more laborious process and does require a lot of time and energy from the staff of the municipality to make it happen. Okay, next slide. So my final slide is on locally led projects. So as I mentioned earlier, sometimes even if a roadway project isn't happening on an IDOT road, if it's on a local road, it may still trigger IDOT's policies for various reasons. So some of the things you'll want to think about there is working with the municipality to really make sure that they're optimizing the project delivery process. So that's where that categorical exclusion that I talked about earlier comes in, making sure that if they can get out of kind of some of the pieces of the phase 1 study, they'll save a lot of time and money. They can also consolidate multi-location projects. So if I know that CDOT does this often, if they get a CMAQ grant, they'll say we're using this grant to pay for 90 different intersection improvements of the same kind. And they'll do all of those intersection improvements under the same contract so that they can kind of save that time of getting approvals from IDOT, getting the permitting done, and it makes everything go a bit more smoothly. You'll also, on locally led projects, to make the case to IDOT, it's always good to have mode count data. So I think the number that they usually go with is there needs to be 20 pedestrians or bicyclists at a crossing to really make the case for an improvement. So just having that data in the back of your back of your pocket, I guess, can really help. You can look at Strava to kind of make the case for, hey, look, this is a really popular bike route. or maybe just do a count if it's near, if there's a large pedestrian volume to make sure that you have the numbers you need. Um, Another thing that you can do to make the case is just to use pilot projects. So sometimes if something's outside of the scope of IDOT's design standards, you may be able to convince them to do a pilot study with you where you're testing the facility for a number of months and seeing how it impacts traffic safety and other factors. And if it's successful, it can then be approved for final approval. So with that, I'll turn the presentation over to Ed Barsotti, who will get into a little bit more about responses to IDOT requests.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
All right. Well, thank you, Heather. That was great information. So I'm Ed Barsotti from Wright, Illinois, and I'd like to describe, just based some of our background, some of our working with IDOT. We, as an organization, especially the last 3 years, have really dug into that MYP, the list of upcoming road projects, to provide design input to IDOT on road projects all around the state. We've done that maybe for 250 projects over the last 3 years. When we do that, we look at the current conditions, we look at latent demand, we take a look at the usage levels right now and what we expect they could be. And then we write letters that include what are the specific requests and engineering recommendations. So if you as an advocate are looking at particular projects, if you do your own digging into the MYP list of upcoming road projects, let us know. We'd be glad to share our results in case we've looked at that same project before. For the next few slides, I'm going to go through a little more detail on the types of responses we've gotten from IDOT over the years. Next slide, please. Okay, so we'll go back to this slide, which shows the different types of projects. Wait. Resurfacing.
Hey, Ed, I think, so you have control as the presenter to advance the slides.
Are we on slide 21 right now?
We're on, or what are we on?
We're on 20.
Types of projects on IDOT's own roads?
21?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, sorry. I think that,
okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha, thanks. So back on this slide, IDOT right now, because of its budget situation, the vast majority of the work that they're doing is resurfacing roads, replacing bridges, usually in rural areas, but also suburban as well, and just a few projects that are the larger type, reconstruction, expansion, intersections, and so on. However, that may be changing if the state does pass a capital bill, which is somewhat expected. There may be a lot more money coming in, so you'll see IDOT doing a lot more than they have been in recent years. Okay. All right, so looking at the issue of the projects that are triggered or that trigger the Complete Streets policies, there's a facility selection table that IDOT has in Chapter 17 of its Bureau of Design and Environment Manual. You can actually find that with a Google search. But there is a table that says what is the primary recommended type of bike facility as a function of the speed limit, the traffic count, whether the road has curbs or it doesn't have curbs. And you'll see this chart that what it is that IDOT will push for. For the vast majority of cases, that ends up being a side path in suburban type of locations. So what we've seen is a whole lot of projects that do include side paths. There are some where side paths have not been built because the local agencies did not want to participate. What I mean by that is there is required, when there is a side path or other bikeway feature added on a reconstruction project, there's required that the locals pay 20% local match, and they also have to agree to maintain it if it's an off-road facility, such as a sidewalk or a side path. So effectively, what we have is that the local agencies have a veto power to be able to say no. That comes up from time to time. For example, with side paths, it's for the general public, it's often easier to do for people to see the need for sidewalks. But when you start talking about bike trails and side paths, there's a segment of the population that maybe aren't as willing to have their town pay the 20%. So we have seen that effect occur, that IDOT comes in saying that a side path bike trail is what's needed, but the town doesn't want to do it. So what happens when that occurs? What we've seen is that IDOT will do what they think is the next highest and best of simply grading the grass along the road so that a future side path could be added later on by the town. Well, that's, we're not big fans of that approach. We think that certainly is not the next best type of facility. And we think that adding a sidewalk or adding paved shoulders or something else should be done instead of simply leaving a grass shelf for future work that probably won't be done. So I guess as advocates, you should be prepared that the locals may have resistance of paying the 20%. There may be some people in town, some decision makers that are unwilling to do so-called bike trails, but they may want to pursue sidewalks instead. So you need to be ready for that and react accordingly. And then finally, for complete streets projects, what we've seen is that there really have not been on-street bike lanes added for IDOT projects. Those bike lanes do require 20% match as well, but they have not been built very often. Interestingly, IDOT does provide shoulders, and when they add shoulders, there is no local match. So the difference between bike lanes and shoulders, it's still asphalt for cyclists, but in one case, the locals have to chip in, and that acts as an obstacle. In the case of bridges, it turns out that one of the advocacy wins we had back in 2009 was that we got IDOT to agree to not having a local match requirement for side paths, shoulders, on-street facilities when it's part of a bridge project, when it's part of a crossing like that. So use that to your advantage, and really the towns have to push for the bridges to be accommodated properly. A bridge replacement only happens once every few decades, and if an opportunity is missed, that could really act as an obstacle in town. So as advocates, make sure that your town knows that there's not a local match, and they should push for something when that bridge is replaced. Another issue is cross streets. By cross streets, I mean some of the lower traffic streets that have stoplights with the IDOT major street. Those quieter streets are often more bike friendly. There's lower traffic. People feel comfortable, but the intersection with the IDOT road can often become an obstacle. What we've seen a lot with road projects is that when IDOT does a reconstruction of their major road, they will also change how that cross street looks right around the intersection. So suddenly you may go from a road with a whole lot of extra width, very comfortable, to one that has 4 or 5 different turn lanes, no extra space, very long crossings, and so on. So that's an area where when you have a complete streets project, you should push that the bike-friendly cross streets are retained as being bike-friendly. Intersections is another issue. The design trend these days is to have intersections with wider turning radius. That allows cars to go around the corner more quickly. Unfortunately, what that does is it forces the crosswalks of either sidewalks or side paths farther back from the main road. And that also pushes the stop line back as well. So it ends up setting up a more dangerous situation for people who are walking or biking on that sidewalk or side path when motorists are not going to listen to the stop line. And that's a source of crashes that we often see. There are ways to get around that. One is with something called a right corner island. It's also called a pork chop. And it's kind of a raised median triangle that separates the right turn lane from the through lanes. That is a treatment that in suburban locations can really help out by isolating the turning motions and making the crossing more like 3 minor crossings rather than one very, very long crossing. Corner islands are in IDOT's manual, but they do have quite a bit of resistance to putting it in there because of things such as the effect on snow plows and trucks and so on. It can be done properly, and it does require advocates in towns. The last one on this slide regards what's called context-sensitive solutions projects. These are really large projects that IDOT convenes a local community advisory group to go over alternatives and make a decision about which alternative will be built with the project. What we have found over the years is that often those groups are dominated by people who are adjacent landowners for the IDOT road project, and they will often drown out the bike and pedestrian concerns. So it's important as advocates to be involved in those groups and speak up on behalf of biking and walking. Okay, so back to resurfacing. And as Heather mentioned, the state complete streets policy is not triggered if IDOT is simply doing a resurfacing project. What we see is that IDOT has a strong institutional resistance to complicating a resurfacing project in any way that would trigger phase one engineering. We're going to go into some examples of what triggers phase one and what doesn't in the next couple of slides or so. But if you do anything that's outside of the ordinary, outside of simply resurfacing the road, then it has to really be driven by the local agency. For example, I think we have a couple people from Park Ridge here, Bussey Woods, Bussey right through the middle of Park Ridge. They're looking at potentially doing a road diet for it. IDOT was simply going to resurface it, but now thanks to advocacy there in Park Ridge, the town is going ahead with a study to look at the feasibility of doing a road diet. That study is a requirement. It's outside of the simple resurfacing work that IDOT wants to do. So the locals really have to drive that effort to do something different. I mentioned that we've done a whole lot of looking at road projects, and that included providing input to IDOT on over 140 resurfacing projects in the Chicagoland area. As I said, there's a lot of resistance institutionally to anything that's beyond phase one. And some of the types of projects that will trigger the need for a phase one study includes anything off-road. Even if you're filling a sidewalk gap, if you want to add a whole new side path on one side, anything off-road is something that's beyond the scope and will require the locals to pay for a lot of it, as well as do the study for it. Second is road diets. And we're going to get into, there's a slide coming up on road diets where you reduce the number of travel lanes, leaving some extra asphalt that you can add bike lanes and other features. So road diets is one that, because you're changing the number of lanes or you're changing the lane configuration, it requires a phase one study, and the locals have to push the issue. And then intersection geometric elements. So if you're doing anything at all to the intersection where you're changing the footprint of it, that also triggers phase one. So when we've asked for the right corner island, the pork chop, to help side path crossing to become safer, that is something that IDOT responded with. We need to do a phase one study, and the locals have to push it. Another category of types of improvements include ones that phase one are not needed, and IDOT may or may not be willing to implement it as part of their resurfacing scope. An example is paving gravel shoulders. In the work that we did when we sent the input on 140 road projects in Chicagoland, IDOT basically said yes to paving gravel shoulders on probably 30 of those. So that's great news. They were looking at that issue for other reasons as well, since paved shoulders help with reducing motorist runoff the road crashes. It also helps with road maintenance. The crumbling occurs on the shoulders rather than on the travel lanes. So IDOT was willing, and we pointed out where our priority locations for that. So if you find a project that simply has a resurfacing scope, you should be optimistic that you might be able to get IDOT to pave gravel shoulders that exist. Rumble strips as well, when there are shoulders, and there are rumble strips that are not good, ones that maybe make it so you can't ride on the paved shoulder at all. That's something that can be changed during a resurfacing project. Another involves crossings, when you have stoplights, but you don't have a pedestrian signal, a pedestrian walk signal. That's something where IDOT is willing to add that as part of the project, and they will add crosswalks when the need is indicated as such. And then finally, just mid-block crossing treatments away from intersections. When you have a trail or whatever that's crossing a roadway, there are a number of different crossing treatments that can be employed. IDOT is in the final stages of coming up with a policy on what treatments are appropriate where. But those treatments are things that could be added to a project without triggering phase one. And then the last category that I have is phase one is not needed, but IDOT doesn't really like the idea. So we found from our response from IDOT that lead pedestrian intervals were not favored by them. What I mean by that is you've seen it in Chicago, you've seen it in other places where maybe you push a trigger for the, you push a pedestrian activation button at the stoplight, and it allows you to get a walk signal that turns on 2-3 seconds before the green light happens. That helps with avoiding conflicts with right turning cars. So this is something that we have asked for from IDOT, but as of now, they're not in favor of it. I think they're maybe going to turn in the right direction there, but we'll see. And then the last one is on-road bicycle detection. There's actually a way that you can put in one of these loops that will be sensitive to an on-road bicycle to trigger a green light at a place called demand actuated stoplights. And we've all been there, where we are unable to trigger a green light because the detector is not picking us up. IDOT is currently not in favor of putting in separate in-road bicycle detection. However, if a local agency does want to paint a marking on the sweet spot of the existing detector, and I'd be glad to talk with anyone about that process, you can actually paint a spot where to position your bike, and then there's an accompanying sign that tells you that's where to put the bike to trigger a green light. So IDOT is more willing to do that if the local agencies push the issue and do the work. Okay. I think we're going to hand it off to Maggie now. Thanks.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Ed. I wanted to go over, sorry, the presentation's loading. So I wanted to just go over with you guys briefly. So how do you get started? Where should you go from here as advocates? So the first thing to do is to find out, are there any upcoming IDOT projects in your area? So Heather pointed out that multi-year plan map that you can look at, or they have a report. So checking that is a good first step, and I will send that out to everyone. We're working on putting together a project tracker for all of you. It'll be a Google document, so it'll have links to different road projects that we know about at the state level and the county and even community level. So that'll be coming out hopefully in a couple weeks, but until then, I'll send you that multi-year plan link. So when you look at that plan, see if you can understand if it's a repaving or a resurfacing project, because as Heather and Ed discussed, a complete streets, the policy may or may not be triggered, and so after you try to look into those details, also kind of see if you can find out what is the timeline of this project. From there, definitely recommend getting in touch with your village, city, or staff. It's always good to get to know them and develop a relationship with them and find out if they know about this project and what is the scope of the project. Just learn from them about what they know. And then ask, are there going to be any bike ped facilities included in that scope already? And do your staff people, planners, public works people, village manager, are they in support of those types of improvements? So just try to kind of understand where things are. And then from there, you may not like the answer you're getting. So then if that's the case, that's when you as an advocate, you can use your advocacy powers and try to gather some community support and try to push through your ideas. So if bicycle pedestrian facilities are not included in the project scope, first step would be to find out, does your community have an active transportation plan, a bike plan, a pedestrian plan? Uh, if that plan exists, as Heather mentioned, that can give you some more power in pushing through those recommendations. But looking at that plan, what is recommended on that road can be a big selling point for showing that there's community support behind these ideas. You can ask your village or city staff person, your contact person, to contact the IDOT project manager of that particular project and request the bike pedestrian facilities that are either in that plan or um, what you and the village staff both think would be appropriate for that road. If you're still getting resistance, you could start a petition if you wanted to show that there is community support for that bike lane or for that trail or for uh, that crosswalk. So if in the end it happens that the bike or pedestrian facility is not going to be an IDOT's plan, the community, your local community, could pay for the improvements with local funding, with other grants. And in that project tracker that I mentioned, there's going to be a tab that includes some different funding sources that we know of. And if you're on the Bike Walk Every Town Google group, I'll continue to email out different grant opportunities that we learn about as they become available. And then just a little bit of information about the road diets that Heather and Ed were mentioning. So road diets, also known as right sizing. I know actually a lot of advocates have reached out to us about this. They've been curious to know, when is it possible to add a road diet, and often you need to be looking at the ADT, or the average daily trips on that road. And and that's a picture there of a successful road diet in Urbana, where the road went from 4 lanes to 3 lanes, and then added bike lanes and some crosswalks and a pedestrian island. But so the average daily trips, the ADT, typically if the road has fewer than 12,000 cars or vehicles traveling on that road every day, it's usually an excellent candidate for a road diet. IDOT may be willing to move forward with the road diet in that case. If the road has under 20,000, but so between 12,000 and 20,000 vehicles per day, that may be a good candidate, more so on the local roads. IDOT may be more resistant to that up to 20,000, but you may be able to convince your local municipality to go forward with the road diet. So one final slide, just to recap the 5 stages that Heather had mentioned in a road project. So there are 5 phases, and really those first 3 when the project is being selected, and then during that phase 1, during the engineering and environmental studies, during the project scoping period, those are the best times for you to get involved, where you can really make a difference and get some biking and walking facilities potentially included in the road project. So we're going to hand this over now to Tim, and then we'll get into Q&A with you if anyone has any questions. So Tim?
Thank you, Maggie, and thanks before to Ed and also Heather for giving really good overview and context for this. When Maggie asked me to speak on this today, she wanted the perspective of someone who's been involved on the implementation side. And I'm a senior planner with Epstein, and I've been involved in implementation and planning projects for surface transportation, and quite a bit on bicycle and pedestrian. So I drew upon 4 case study examples that I wanted to talk through today. So I just have one slide, but I was going to wrap things up here, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A so I can share with you kind of what my experience has been. And they run the gamut based on kind of how Heather, Maggie, and Ed talked about the various different contexts in which you might interact with IDOT. And so the first one I wanted to start with is actually a little bit on the older side as far as the examples go, but I found it helpful because of the way that it relates to transportation networks you may be interested in improving in your community. So this is from the village of Glenview. Not the photo here on the screen, but the example is the village of Glenview. The Shermer Road used to be a road that used to be under the jurisdiction of IDOT, but was actually going through a process known as jurisdictional transfer. And that's somewhat rare, in which the state will actually turn over jurisdiction of a roadway to the local municipality if it's not part of the national highway system and it's not part of their strategic regional arterial network. They're willing to negotiate with a municipality to say, we'll resurface it one last time and then we'll hand it over, at which point it becomes a local roadway. And I was involved in the development of their master plan for bicycle facilities. And in 2008, it was adopted as a plan as a high priority recommendation. And then just the very next year, they moved right into implementation. And the village chose to do implementation in-house. And this was what was described just before this as a road diet. Shermer Road used to be 2 lanes in each direction, and the village was interested in transforming it to 1 lane in each direction, a center left turn lane, and then they had room for bike lanes on either side. Because this was a local road, they didn't need to do the same level of coordination. And as a result, they were able to go through with it. And per Maggie's comment, because it had at the time fewer than 10,000 vehicles in a single day, it was an excellent candidate for a road diet and was implemented as a local project. So that one is kind of unique in that it's locally owned and locally funded, which involved very minimal coordination with IDOT. The second that I wanted to talk about is what Maggie touched on, which are the IDOT jurisdiction roadway bike projects. And I'll admit that I don't have a lot of experience in that one, so I reached out to colleagues who do, and I would say that those who probably have the most experience in implementing bike projects on roadways under IDOT's jurisdiction is actually the Chicago Department of Transportation. And mind you, they have quite a larger group of professionals involved in doing so. And they implement theirs through 2 mechanisms. The first is that the city of Chicago has their Streets for Cycling plan, which identifies quite a lot of corridors for that type of improvement. And the second is that they have a mechanism where they do regular resurfacing of arterial roadways within the city, known as their arterial resurfacing program. So the example that I inquired about was actually a project that's scheduled for this year, which is on North Avenue. And it's in the city of Chicago, but it's under the jurisdiction of IDOT. So CDOT is actually doing the design, and they're doing the resurfacing using the arterial resurfacing funds. And so they're actually narrowing existing travel lanes. They're not doing a road diet per se. They're just narrowing the existing lanes that are out there within an acceptable range. They're putting down pavement markings to identify where the parking lane is, and they are installing bike lanes as a result. As part of their scope, they did have to do their own crash analysis to justify that this would work. And in the city of Chicago, it's subject to approval by the local alderman. So they have a few additional levels to go through, but because it's in their plan and they were willing to do the additional study on their own, they're able to get that implemented. And there is, as Heather mentioned, some language from the BDE that determines what type of community engagement might be needed, because this the resulting roadway change is actually referred to as a significant change to roadway function, which triggered the need for some community engagement to make sure that there is community support for the project. Fortunately, there is, and that is permitting them to move ahead with the project in the coming year. So that's a unique one, that it is IDOT jurisdiction, but the local municipality, in this case the city of Chicago, is doing that local contribution and local match. The third example is from a recently adopted plan by the Village of Northbrook, and I reached out to them to inquire about the status of this. And this is one where they don't actually have any project in the works just yet. But to Heather's point and Ed's point about getting in early, they actually are having a meeting with IDOT whereby they're going to go through their plan and actually, as was mentioned before, they're going to overlay what's recommended in their plan with all of the projects that are in IDOT's multi-year program that occur within the village. And they'll talk about identifying project scope before any of those move into that level of involvement. So as Heather mentioned, by getting in early, they're able to have that discussion right off the bat about what can be done, and that they are willing to contribute their local match in order to do so. So that's unique in that they do want to look at the multi-year program. Some examples that come out of that project involve Dundee Road, and then also knowing that the Skokie Valley Trail is currently in the works traveling through there, they know that there will be some improvements that are adjacent to Dundee in the presence of the trail. So they're looking to coordinate on projects that are being led both Cook County and in the Village of Northbrook with what IDOT is planning on doing. And the last example, this one is actually very early, but I wanted to mention it because of the role that it's playing in the fact that it's an IDOT facility and it's an IDOT-led project with the help of consultant assistance. This one is Illinois 62, which is in Cook County. This is one where, as Ed mentioned, there is a regional plan for incorporating complete streets improvements, both at a policy level and in the Northwest or Northeast Illinois Regional Trails Plan. Identifying this as a corridor that should be considered is that IDOT is going to consider the incorporation of bicycle facilities as part of the overall project. It's pretty early in this stage, as in that it's way back in phase one, and that there still is a requirement for a local match in order for implementation. However, this one's unique in that one of the largest landowners in the project area is actually the Forest Preserve. So when you're thinking about, as advocates, that the local match needs to be all on your village or your city, keep in mind that there's other agencies that are not IDOT that also could be considered local agency. So if you have a park district, if the area in which the project is located involves a forest preserve, or even another agency such as Cook or Lake or McHenry or DuPage County Transportation, they also can interact in that capacity. So when you're thinking about who to talk to in terms of getting support for your project, keep in mind that you can coordinate with all those other agencies to help identify whether or not there's a plan, identifying that local support, and then also exposing you to the chance of getting additional resources. So those were the 4 examples that I wanted to present, but I also wanted to make sure to turn it back over to Maggie so that we can go into Q&A and we can answer any additional questions on that or anything else that Heather and Ed and Maggie have covered this afternoon. So thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Tim. If any of you have any questions, feel free to type something in the comment box. We did have Terry Witt was wondering, does IDOT have a specific person assigned as the go-to person for biking? Tim or Ed, have you worked with anyone in particular that advocates could potentially reach out to?
Carlos Feliciano is a contact right now.
Mm-hmm. So we can probably get his email address and send it to you, Terry. Does anyone else have any questions? If you're also welcome to unmute yourself and speak if you had anything you wanted to bring up. Oh, sorry, I think someone was speaking, but it was kind of mumbled. If so, for some reason we're having trouble hearing you, but if you are able to type your message or email me, I'm Maggie at activetrans.org. I can relay the question.
And Maggie, while that's happening, I also thought I would chime in and say that in speaking with the village of Northbrook most recently, one thing that was mentioned is that because they have a working relationship in their public works department, they've actually found that it's quite easy to just schedule a meeting, if it's by telephone or even in person, whereby you can go through any kind of plans or concepts that the village or the city has that you'd like to formalize so that they're made aware of that. And this goes to the point of saying the earlier the better, is if you can coordinate with them before they begin that scoping process, it is much more likely that that type of study is included when they go into phase one, so that it's not something that has to happen in those later phases. So if you do have an already accepted active transportation plan, or you are expressing an interest in going about that process, even letting IDOT know at that time, I think is a great way to establish that relationship so that you're able to reach out to someone as you go through the process, and then they would continue to be a point of contact when you move forward in implementation.
Yeah, thank you. That's great advice. All right, so we've got a question. Could you talk about the line between advocating as constituents to IDOT directly versus asking municipal staff to do so?
I think enlisting the town is probably the best strategy.
Mm-hmm.
It carries a lot of weight, especially when they're the ones that have to pay for additional things. You're going to have to get your town on board.
Right.
Yeah, I would agree with Ed in that when you're interested in, and I see that Jeff has a follow-up, is what's appropriate and effective. I would say that the most effective method is by going through that process as a municipality, even if you're a group, whereby you go through the planning process, and then when someone from the municipality can then go to IDOT and state that you have a plan in the works, or even if you have a policy and you don't have necessarily a plan, but you have a complete streets policy, they're much more able to work with the municipal representative, so that it's a funneling through. And this is primarily because of they want to make sure that there's consensus at the local level before anything that IDOT plans to do is not considered to be in consensus with the community. So they want to move forward recognizing that that process and that step has already been done. So if you as an advocate are very interested, I would say that working directly with local representatives, even to go through the process of a plan or a policy, is a very helpful first step, especially because the complete streets policy that the state has adopted shall consider when there is demonstrated community support, and a planning process is the best evidence that they use in order to identify that.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. All right. Well, we're a little over time, so if any of you have any other questions, you can see our email addresses up there on the PowerPoint, and I will email all of you who are on this webinar today with some resources, and we'll get this recording out as well so you can re-listen and keep learning. IDOT is a complicated agency, so it takes a while to kind of understand it, and we're all learning together. So thank you so much, Ed, Heather, Tim. Really appreciate you taking the time to share your knowledge of working with IDOT. And yes, everyone, thanks for joining, and we'll be in touch.